At 3:14 in the morning, on the 11th night of my surveillance operation, a figure in a rain jacket walked calmly across my backyard, knelt beside my koi pond, and poured a plastic jug of something into the water. And I watched the entire thing happen in real time on my phone in crisp infrared clarity, because by that point I had 14 cameras covering every square foot of that yard, and not one of them missed a single second. I want to tell you how I got to that morning, because 6 weeks earlier, I would have told you I was the kind of person who gave people the benefit of the doubt. By the end of this story, I promise you, I was not that person anymore, and I don't regret it for a second. My name is Simon Okafor. I live in Ridgeline Meadows, a community of about 230 homes built around a series of small ponds that give the neighborhood its name, though most of them are decorative, shallow, and mostly ornamental. Mine was different. My koi pond had been 6 years in the making, dug by hand over 2 summers with the help of my brother-in-law, lined properly, filtered with a system I'd researched obsessively, and stocked, slowly and carefully, with fish that were not the $2 feeder koi you find at a big box pet store. My oldest fish, a butterfly koi with a pattern my daughter Nia named Marble when she was 7, was going on his 5th year with us, close to 2 feet long, and worth, by the honest appraisal of the breeder I bought him from, somewhere north of $800 on his own. That pond was not a hobby I took lightly, and I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened to it, because I think it matters for understanding just how much restraint it took me not to do something reckless the morning I found 4 of my fish floating, and how, instead, I channeled every bit of that fury into something far more useful than rage. I channeled it into evidence. The woman at the center of this story is named Glenda Fitch, and she had been president of the Ridgeline Meadows Homeowners Association board for just over a year by the time this all started, having taken the position after running on what she called, at the candidate forum the previous spring, a platform of restoring natural harmony to our community landscaping standards. I remember thinking, at the time, that phrase sounded pleasant enough, even a little vague in a harmless way. I did not yet understand that Glenda had a very specific and very personal obsession buried inside that phrase, and that obsession happened to be koi ponds. It turned out, though none of us knew this when she was elected, that Glenda had experienced what she described in various HOA newsletters over the following months as negative encounters with ornamental ponds in a previous community she'd lived in. Encounters that, as far as I could ever piece together, amounted to nothing more than a mosquito complaint from over a decade earlier that had somehow calcified into a full-blown personal crusade. Within 4 months of taking office, Glenda had pushed through, using a technicality in our governing documents that allowed the board limited emergency authority over environmental hazard mitigation, a new rule requiring all ornamental ponds over 100 gallons to be registered, inspected quarterly, and treated with an approved algaecide from a list of 3 specific products, one of which, I later learned through my own research, was explicitly listed by its own manufacturer as unsafe for use in ponds containing live fish. I complied with the registration requirement immediately because I try to be a reasonable person about these things, and because I genuinely didn't think, at first, that any of this was aimed specifically at me. My pond was inspected, passed without issue, since it was immaculately maintained, and had never once had a mosquito problem thanks to a proper aeration system I'd installed years earlier specifically to prevent that exact issue. But I declined to add any of the 3 approved algaecides, since my pond's water quality was already excellent, verified through weekly testing I did myself as part of routine koi care, and I submitted, in writing, a request for an exemption based on the fact that 2 of the 3 approved products were explicitly labeled by their manufacturers as harmful to fish. Glenda denied the exemption within 2 days, a response time that struck me even then as unusually fast for a board that typically took 2 to 3 weeks to respond to far simpler requests. I want to walk you through the 8 weeks that followed that denial, because it's important context for understanding why, by the time I finally installed those cameras, I had already exhausted almost every reasonable channel available to me. I appealed the denial in writing, citing the manufacturer safety labels directly. I requested a meeting with the full board, which Glenda scheduled, then rescheduled twice, then finally held in a session where she spent most of the allotted time discussing an unrelated dispute about mailbox paint colors before informing me, with 11 minutes left on the agenda, that my exemption request was still under review. I brought in a letter from the pond and koi specialist who had helped me design the original system 6 years earlier, explaining in professional detail why the mandated products posed a genuine risk to my fish. Glenda's response to that letter, delivered by email, was a single line informing me that the board did not consider outside contractor opinions binding on association policy decisions. Somewhere around week 6 of this back and forth, a neighbor of mine, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Desmond Achterberg, who lived 2 houses down and had, unbeknownst to me at the time, been dealing with his own small-scale conflict with Glenda over an entirely unrelated matter involving a detached shed, mentioned something to me at the mailbox that I initially dismissed as neighborhood gossip. He said he'd seen Glenda walking along the shared easement path behind our houses on more than one early morning, at hours that struck him as odd for a casual walk, always pausing near my property line before continuing on. I didn't think much of it at the time. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important to admit that even with all the tension building around the exemption dispute, it genuinely had not occurred to me that this might escalate into someone actually harming my fish. I assumed, at worst, that this was going to end in some kind of frustrating but survivable compliance fight, maybe a fine, maybe a formal violation notice, the standard bureaucratic unpleasantness that HOA disputes usually amount to. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early June, I walked out to feed my fish before work and found 4 of them floating at the surface, including a young female I'd named Ripple, purchased less than a year earlier, and a second, older fish that had been part of the pond's original stocking 6 years before. The water had a faint chemical smell I didn't recognize, sharp and slightly bitter, nothing like the earthy mineral scent I'd grown accustomed to from 6 years of daily maintenance. My aeration system, which I checked immediately out of instinct, was functioning perfectly. My filtration system showed no mechanical failure. Whatever had happened to that water had happened suddenly, and it had happened from the outside. I did not call the HOA that day. I called a water testing lab instead, one that specialized in aquaculture and ornamental pond diagnostics, and paid a rush fee to have a technician come out that same afternoon to collect samples before anything further degraded or diluted whatever had caused this. I want to tell you, because I think it matters enormously for how the rest of this story unfolds, that this decision to prioritize evidence collection over confrontation, over grief, over the very reasonable urge to march straight to Glenda's front door and demand an explanation, was the single most important choice I made in this entire ordeal. The lab results came back 4 days later. The water showed elevated concentrations of copper sulfate, a compound that, in the specific quantity detected, was consistent with exactly the kind of algaecide product Glenda's mandate had required me to use, at a dose significantly higher than even the product's own label recommended for ponds without fish, let alone a pond stocked with mature koi. The technician who delivered the results told me, in a tone I remember as carefully neutral but unmistakably grim, that this was not the kind of contamination that happens from runoff or accident. This was a concentration that suggested a direct, deliberate application. I sat with that information for exactly 1 evening before I made my decision, not to confront anyone yet, not to post anything on the community forum, where half the neighborhood was already gossiping about ongoing tension between me and the board over the exemption fight, where any accusation I made without proof would immediately be dismissed as an aggrieved homeowner lashing out. I decided instead to make absolutely certain that if this happened again, and some quiet instinct told me it very well might, I would have proof so complete and so undeniable that there would be no room left for denial, misdirection, or plausible explanation. I called a security company the next morning. I want to walk you through the system I built, partly because I think it's genuinely useful information for anyone who ever finds themselves in a similar situation, and partly because the sheer scale of it, 14 cameras covering a backyard that was maybe a third of an acre, tells you something important about how seriously I was taking this by that point. I installed 4 cameras covering the pond itself from multiple angles, ensuring there was no possible blind spot along its perimeter. I installed cameras covering both side yard access points, the gate on the east side that led toward the shared easement path Desmond had mentioned, and the gate on the west side that faced the street. I installed cameras along the back fence line at the base of the deck, angled up toward the yard, and 2 more mounted high on the eaves of my house, giving a wide overhead view of the entire property. Every single one of them had night vision capability, infrared illumination that could pick up clear, detailed footage in complete darkness, because I understood, even before I had proof, that whatever had happened to my pond had almost certainly happened at night or in the very early hours of morning, when the neighborhood was quiet and nobody would be watching. I set the system to record continuously, backed up to a cloud storage account, with motion-triggered alerts that would notify my phone the instant anything moved in the yard after dark. And then I waited. I refilled the pond with treated water. I restocked, cautiously, with 3 new fish, an act that felt, honestly, a little bit like bait, though I told myself at the time it was simply about not letting Glenda's actions stop me from maintaining the pond I'd spent 6 years building. I submitted, once again, a formal written notice to the HOA board informing them of the contamination incident, the lab results, and a formal demand that the mandated algaecide requirement be suspended pending investigation. Glenda's response, delivered 3 days later through the management office, stated that the board had reviewed my complaint and found no evidence linking any association action to the incident described, and that my exemption request remained denied. I remember reading that email standing in my kitchen, near doing homework at the counter beside me, and feeling something settle into place that was less like anger and more like a very cold, very clear resolve. I did not respond to that email. I simply closed my laptop, checked that all 14 cameras were recording properly, and went to bed. For the first week, nothing happened. I started to wonder honestly whether the contamination had been a one-time act, some kind of impulsive decision made in the heat of our dispute that Glenda, having gotten away with once, might not repeat now that there was clearly heightened attention on the situation. Desmond, when I mentioned this to him over the fence one evening, shook his head slowly and told me something that stuck with me for the rest of that summer. People like that, he said, don't stop because they got what they wanted. They stop because someone finally makes them stop. Until then, they just get more careful. He was right, though it took 11 nights for me to find out exactly how right he was, and exactly how far Glenda Fitch was willing to go to make sure her version of natural harmony won out over 6 years of my own careful work, over my daughter's favorite fish, and over what I would soon learn was a personal history with ornamental ponds that went far deeper and far stranger than a decade-old mosquito complaint. Because when I finally reviewed the footage from that 11th night, in full, slowly, frame by frame, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me at 4 in the morning, I found something in the recording that went beyond a simple act of vandalism. I found a pattern, one that stretched back. I would later confirm through a very different kind of investigation entirely, far longer than the 8 weeks of our exemption dispute. And what I did with that footage over the following month is the reason Glenda Fitch's name eventually appeared in a local news segment about HOA misconduct, and the reason the Ridgeline Meadows governing documents now contain, permanently, a clause that homeowners still refer to, half joking and half in earnest gratitude, as Simon's rule. That's where part 2 picks up. The alert hit my phone at 3:11 in the morning, a soft buzzing notification that I'd grown almost used to ignoring over the previous 10 nights, since raccoons and the occasional stray cat had triggered the motion sensors often enough that I'd stopped jumping up every single time. This time, though, something made me actually open the app instead of rolling back over, and what I saw on that screen woke me up completely. A figure in a dark rain jacket, hood up despite the fact that it hadn't rained in Ridgeline Meadows in over a week, was walking across my backyard with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this exact walk before and knows precisely where the motion sensor blind spots used to be. Except, of course, there were no blind spots left, not with 14 cameras covering every inch of that yard. I watched, my heart pounding, as the figure knelt beside the pond, produced a plastic jug from inside the jacket, unscrewed the cap, and poured its contents slowly and deliberately into the water, moving the jug in a slow arc to distribute it evenly, the way someone might water a garden bed they'd tended 100 times before. I recorded my own screen with a second phone, an instinct that turned out to matter enormously later, before doing anything else. Then I switched to the camera angle from the east eave, the one with the clearest overhead view, and watched the same figure straighten up, glance briefly toward the house, a motion that brought the hood back just enough for the infrared to catch a clear, unmistakable profile. It was Glenda Fitch. I sat on the edge of my bed at 3:14 in the morning with my hands actually shaking, not from fear, but from something closer to vindication, so sharp it felt almost like grief, and I watched her walk calmly back toward the east gate, the one leading to the shared easement path, and disappear from frame. I did not go outside. I did not call the police that night, though I understand why some people might have. I wanted more than anything to be absolutely certain that what I had was complete, unimpeachable, and legally sound before I did anything with it, because I understood, even in that adrenaline-soaked moment, that a rushed confrontation could give Glenda room to claim the footage was doctored or ambiguous or somehow taken out of context. Instead, I spent the rest of that night, unable to sleep anyway, downloading and backing up every second of footage from all 14 cameras to 3 separate storage locations, time-stamped, unedited, complete. The next morning, I called the same water testing lab that had confirmed the copper sulfate contamination weeks earlier and had a technician come collect a fresh sample within hours. The results, delivered 2 days later, showed the exact same compound at a nearly identical concentration to the first incident. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Odette Marchetti, and she specialized in property damage and civil disputes, with a substantial amount of prior experience, specifically involving homeowners associations, a specialty that turned out to be extremely useful given everything Glenda had also done procedurally with the exemption denials and the mandated algaecide rule itself. Odette watched the footage in her office, replaying the clearest angle 3 times, and then set down her tablet and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as barely restrained professional delight. "This is about as clean a case as I've ever been handed," she said. "You have prior contamination with matching lab results. You have a documented pattern of DENID exemptions despite manufacturer safety warnings you submitted in writing. And now you have clear, time-stamped video evidence of the association's own board president trespassing onto your property at 3 in the morning to commit what is, at minimum, criminal mischief and property damage, and what a prosecutor might well consider animal cruelty given the value and nature of the fish involved. This isn't a civil dispute anymore, Simon. This is a police matter first, and a civil matter second." We filed a police report that same week, submitting the footage along with the lab results from both incidents. A detective assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Sergeant Byrne, told us during our initial interview that the footage was, in her professional assessment, more than sufficient to support charges, but that she wanted to understand the fuller context before moving forward, specifically the earlier claim Glenda had made about a negative encounter with ponds in a previous community that had seemingly motivated her mandate policy in the first place. That inquiry is what led to the discovery that turned this from a strange, isolated act of vandalism into something considerably darker. Sergeant Byrne's investigation, which included a records request to Glenda's previous homeowners association 2 states away, turned up something none of us had expected. The negative encounter Glenda had referenced in her Ridgeline Meadows campaign materials was not, as she'd implied, a simple mosquito complaint. It was a formal police report, filed nearly 9 years earlier, in which a neighbor in that previous community had accused Glenda of deliberately poisoning her ornamental pond, following an almost identical dispute over mandated pond maintenance rules that Glenda herself had pushed through as a board member there as well. That earlier case had never resulted in charges, largely, according to the old report Sergeant Byron obtained, because the neighbor at the time had no camera evidence, and the case had ultimately come down to circumstantial suspicion that a prosecutor had declined to pursue. Glenda had moved out of that community less than a year later, and as far as anyone in Ridgeline Meadows had known when she ran for our own board, arrived here with nothing more than a vague personal opinion about pond maintenance and absolutely no disclosed history of the kind. This is what we call, in the business, a demonstrated pattern, Sergeant Byron told us, echoing, though I didn't know it at the time, almost exactly the language a different investigator had used in an entirely separate case involving an HOA president and a family's sensory garden, a story I only heard about much later and recognized, with a strange chill, how similar the shape of these situations can be. A single incident with strong evidence is a good case. A demonstrated pattern across two separate communities, with a clear procedural mechanism, mandated maintenance rules she herself authored, used to manufacture the opportunity both times. That's the kind of pattern that makes a prosecutor's job very easy. Glenda was formally charged 6 weeks later with criminal mischief, trespassing, and a specific animal cruelty statute in our state that covers the malicious injury or killing of privately owned animals, which, as Odette had predicted, applied cleanly to koi valued individually in the hundreds of dollars. I want to tell you about the HOA side of this, because the criminal case, while it mattered enormously, was only half of what needed to happen. Odette helped me file a formal complaint with the full board, this time bypassing Glenda entirely given the obvious conflict of interest, and requesting an emergency general membership meeting to address both her immediate removal from the board and the underlying algaecide mandate that had created the pretext for all of this in the first place. That meeting happened on a Wednesday evening, held, appropriately enough given how the last similar story I'd heard about had unfolded, in the community clubhouse, packed with residents who had, by that point, heard enough fragments of the story through the neighborhood grapevine to know something significant was coming, even if most of them didn't yet know the full details. I did not need to do much talking at that meeting, honestly, which felt strange after weeks of carrying this entire case largely on my own. Odette presented the footage, with the audio and video clearly time and date stamped, to a room that went from restless murmuring to absolute, stunned silence within about 90 seconds of the recording starting. I watched people's faces change in real time as they watched their own HOA president, the woman who had run on a platform of restoring natural harmony, calmly poisoning a neighbor's pond at 3 in the morning. When the footage ended, nobody said anything for what felt like a genuinely uncomfortable length of time before a woman near the back, someone I recognized as a longtime resident who had actually voted for Glenda in the original election, said quietly but clearly, "I am so sorry, Simon. We had no idea." The board voted that night, unanimously, minus Glenda's own vote, which she was barred from casting given the obvious conflict, to remove her from the presidency immediately, to fully rescind the mandated algaecide policy she'd authored, and to formally apologize to me on behalf of the association for the 8 weeks I'd spent fighting a bureaucratic battle over a rule that had, it turned out, existed for the specific purpose of giving her legal cover to do exactly what she'd done. The criminal case concluded about 7 months later. Facing overwhelming video evidence, matching lab results from 2 separate incidents, and a documented prior pattern from her previous community that the prosecutor was able to introduce as evidence of intent, Glenda accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended jail sentence, several years of probation, mandatory restitution covering the value of the fish lost along with my legal and lab costs, and a formal restraining order barring her from my property. As part of the broader civil settlement Odette negotiated alongside the criminal case, Glenda also agreed to sell her home and relocate, A condition I understand is unusual to include in this kind of settlement, but that Odette fought hard for, given the clear pattern suggesting this was not a woman who was likely to simply let go of a grudge on her own. I want to tell you what happened to Marble, my oldest koi, the one near named when she was 7, because I know some of you reading this have been wondering. He survived both incidents. He was one of the 4 fish I found in distress that first Tuesday morning, but not among the 4 that didn't make it. And by the time the second contamination occurred 11 nights later, he'd been moved, along with 2 other survivors, to a quarantine tank inside my garage as a precaution while I was still working out how to secure the pond properly, which is part of why the second poisoning only affected the 3 new fish I'd restocked with as bait, a decision that, in hindsight, I feel a complicated mixture of guilt and grim necessity about even now. The pond itself is thriving again. It took the better part of a year to fully restock and rebuild the water chemistry back to where it had been before any of this happened. But Marble is out there now, nearly 6 feet from where I'm writing this, moving slowly through water that belongs entirely to my family again, protected by a security system that admittedly I never fully powered down even after the case concluded, because some habits, once you've needed them that badly, are hard to let go of. If there's a lesson in this story, and I've thought about it a great deal over the many months since, it's something Sergeant Byron said to me during one of our final interviews before the case went to plea. She said that people who abuse positions of small, local authority, whether it's an HOA board seat or something else entirely, often count on 2 things working in their favor. They count on the assumption that ordinary people won't take the trouble to document things properly, and they count on communities being reluctant to believe that someone who seems competent and organized on the surface is capable of something genuinely malicious underneath. I didn't count on either of those assumptions holding, and I'd encourage anyone reading this who finds themselves facing something similar, a neighbor, a board member, anyone using a position of authority to target you personally under the cover of official policy, to do exactly what I did. Don't confront first, document first. Because it turns out that 14 cameras, 3 storage backups, and 1 very long, very patient night of not sleeping were worth more than any amount of righteous shouting I could have done at that HOA meeting. And they're the entire reason Glenda Fitch is not currently serving as the board president of some other unsuspecting community 2 states away, quietly authoring her next mandated maintenance policy and waiting for the right dark, quiet night to use it. Thumbnail text: SHEPOSONED, MY fish on camera.